When you've lost everything, even a rusted key feels like a cruel joke. That's exactly what 61-year-old Cal Remer thought when his grandfather's will left him nothing but a key to a broken-down tractor. His neighbors laughed. His own kids had stopped calling. Cal was broke and alone, standing in a dusty barn with nothing but memories. But he turned that key anyway. The tractor didn't start, but something else did. Hidden beneath the seat was a metal box containing old land deeds and a letter. Inside was something that would change everything, 100 acres no one knew existed, and a family secret buried for decades. But why would his grandfather hide this from everyone, even his own family? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is even more remarkable. Cal Remer had learned to measure his life in small defeats. At 61, he'd stopped expecting miracles and started accepting that some men were simply built for struggle. The construction business he'd poured 20 years into had collapsed during the recession, taking his savings, his marriage, and eventually his home with it. Now he lived in a single-wide trailer at the edge of Millerton, Pennsylvania, where the rent was cheap and the neighbors minded their own business. The trailer park sat on the unfashionable side of town, where the pavement cracked and the streetlights flickered. Cal's unit was number 17, a beige box with a sagging porch and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. Inside, everything was second-hand, but clean. He'd learned to live with less. A narrow kitchen, a living room barely big enough for a couch and television, a bedroom that fit a double bed and not much else. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, but it was the life he had. Most days, Cal worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences, patching roofs, hauling debris. The work was irregular and the pay modest, but it kept him fed and gave him a reason to get up in the morning. His hands were still strong, his back still capable of a full day's labor. He took pride in that. A man could lose his business, his wife, his home, but if he could still work, he could still hold his head up. His ex-wife Diane had remarried 5 years ago and moved to Ohio with her new husband, a regional manager for a pharmaceutical company. Cal didn't begrudge her the stability. Their marriage had died slowly, worn down by financial stress and his long absences on job sites. When she finally asked for the divorce, he'd signed the papers without argument. Some things couldn't be fixed, no matter how good you were with your hands. They had 2 children. Penny was 35 now, living 2 hours away in Harrisburg. She worked as a nursing assistant at a rehabilitation center, pulling double shifts to support her 10-year-old daughter. Penny's own marriage had ended badly 3 years back, and she carried a bitterness that seemed to color everything. Her calls to Cal were infrequent and brief, obligatory check-ins that left both of them feeling worse. He wanted to help her, wanted to be the father she needed, but there was a distance between them that neither seemed able to bridge. Graham, his son, was 32 and living in Philadelphia. He worked in tech sales and was always chasing the next big opportunity, the startup that would finally make him rich. Graham had inherited his father's optimism without the work ethic, always looking for the shortcut, the angle. Their conversations felt transactional, Graham calling when he needed money, Cal making excuses about why he couldn't help. The truth was, Cal barely had enough for himself. Millerton itself was a town in decline, population 3,200 and falling. Main Street had more empty storefronts than open businesses. The old textile mill had closed in the 90s, and the farms that once surrounded the town were being sold off piece by piece to developers from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Young people left for college and rarely came back. The ones who stayed were mostly older folks, people like Cal, who had roots too deep to pull up, even when the soil turned sour. Cal had grown up in Millerton, spent his childhood summers at his grandfather's farm just outside town. Harold Remer had been a quiet man, a World War II veteran who rarely spoke about the war but carried it in his eyes. He'd worked as a mechanic after coming home, living simply on a small plot with a barn, a vegetable garden, and an old John Deere tractor that seemed to run on willpower alone. Those summer visits were the best memories of Cal's childhood. Harold, teaching him to change oil, to read the land, to fix what was broken, instead of throwing it away. His grandmother had died when Cal was 7, and after that it was just Harold and the farm, a place of quiet routine and unspoken wisdom. Harold never raised his voice, never wasted words, but when he spoke, you listened. The old man had lived to 93, his mind sharp until the very end. When he died 3 weeks ago, Cal had driven out to the farmhouse to help settle the estate. The place was exactly as he remembered, the barn still standing, the tractor still sitting under a tarp, the vegetable garden now overgrown with weeds. Harold had been living alone, refusing all offers to move into assisted living, insisting he'd die on his own land, in his own bed. And he had. The funeral had been small, a dozen people at most, mostly elderly neighbours and a few veterans from the VFW post. Harold had outlived most of his friends. Cal sat in the front pew with Penny, who'd driven up for the day, and Graham, who'd flown in that morning and would fly out that evening. Neither of his children had known their great-grandfather well. That was Cal's fault, another connection he'd failed to maintain. After the service, they'd gathered at the farmhouse for the reading of the will. The lawyer, a young woman from a firm in town, had gone through the brief document efficiently. The house and land, just 2 acres, would be sold, the proceeds divided between a few local charities Harold had supported. His personal effects, what few there were, could be claimed by family. And then the lawyer had handed Cal a small manila envelope. Inside was a single key, rusted and worn, attached to a metal tag stamped with the John Deere logo. The lawyer explained that Harold had left specific instructions. The key was for Cal alone, with a note that simply read, "Check the tractor." Cal had turned the key over in his hands, confused. His grandfather's tractor was worthless, a rusted hulk that hadn't run in decades. Penny had smirked. Graham had checked his phone. The neighbours had offered sympathetic nods, probably thinking the old man's mind had slipped at the end after all. But Cal had taken the key. That evening, after everyone else had left, he'd walked out to the barn. The building leaned slightly to the left, its roof patched with mismatched shingles. Inside, the air smelled of old hay and motor oil. The tractor sat in the far corner, covered in dust, surrounded by forgotten tools and coils of rope. Cal had approached it slowly, almost reverently. He brushed off the seat, revealing cracked leather and exposed springs. Then, more out of respect than expectation, he'd slid the key into the ignition and turned it. Nothing. The engine didn't even click. But something else did. Beneath the seat, a hidden compartment had popped open, a metal panel Cal had never known existed. Inside was a small tin box, the kind that might have once held tobacco or cookies. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out. The box wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, were 3 folded documents, yellowed with age, land deeds. Each one bore his grandfather's signature and dates from the late 1940 seconds. There was also a small leather ledger filled with handwritten entries, and beneath it all, a sealed envelope with "To whoever finds this first," written across the front in Harold's careful script. Cal had stood there in the fading light, holding his grandfather's secrets, and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Cal didn't sleep that night. He sat at his small kitchen table under the flickering fluorescent light, the tin box open before him, and read his grandfather's letter 3 times. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same careful script that had labelled jars in the cellar, the same precise lettering that had marked tools in the barn. Harold's hand had been steady even in his 90s, but this letter was dated the 15th of January, 1984, 40 years ago. Cal would have been 21 then, newly married, full of plans. Asterisk. To whoever finds this first, asterisk, asterisk. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and it's time someone knew the truth. Between 1946 and 1948, I purchased 3 parcels of land, totaling 127 acres. I paid cash $8,750 over 30 months. The money came from my military savings and what I could put aside from my wages at Morrison's garage. Asterisk. Asterisk. The land sits 2 miles northwest of the old Millerton boundary, along what used to be called Kettle Creek. I bought it from a speculator named J.K. Sutton, who was selling off properties after the Depression. I never registered the deeds with the county. I never told your grandmother, never told your father, never told anyone. Asterisk. Asterisk. I had my reasons, though they might not make sense to you now. I wanted something that was mine alone, something that couldn't be taxed or taken or borrowed against. I wanted land that could just be land, not property, not investment, just earth and trees and water. I thought maybe someday, when the family needed it most, this could be a gift, a fresh start. Asterisk. Asterisk. The deeds are legal. The transactions were witnessed. The land is real. What you do with it is up to you, but I hope you'll think carefully before deciding. Land means different things to different people. To me, it meant freedom, a place that couldn't be touched by governments or banks or bad luck. Asterisk. Asterisk. I'm sorry for the secrecy. I'm sorry if this causes confusion or trouble. But I'm not sorry for keeping this piece of earth safe all these years. Maybe you'll understand why. Asterisk. Asterisk. Your grandfather. Asterisk. Asterisk. Harold James Remer. Asterisk. Cal had set the letter down and opened the ledger, page after page of entries, each one dated and detailed. February 1946, $250 paid to J.K. Sutton, first parcel. March 1946, $300 paid to J.K. Sutton, first parcel. The payments continued monthly, sometimes twice a month, small amounts that added up over time. The final entry was dated November 1948, $200 paid to J.K. Sutton, third parcel. Balance complete. The 3 deeds were brittle with age but legible. Each described a parcel of land in technical language, metes and bounds, survey markers, acreage. The first was 42 acres, the second 38, the third 47, together 127 acres. Each deed bore Harold's signature and the signature of J.K. Sutton, witnessed by a notary whose stamp had faded to a pale ghost of itself. Cal had spread the documents across his table and tried to process what he was seeing. His grandfather had owned land, significant land, for 75 years, and never told anyone, never used it, never developed it, never even acknowledged its existence. The land had simply sat there, unknown and unclaimed, while Harold worked his whole life as a mechanic and lived on 2 modest acres. It didn't make sense. Why buy land and then hide it? Why keep it secret even from family? Harold had lived simply, sometimes struggled financially, yet he'd owned property that might have eased those struggles. Cal thought about his own childhood. Times when money had been tight, when his father had worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. Had Harold known? Had he chosen to stay silent even then? The questions churned in Cal's mind until dawn broke grey and cold through his trailer windows. He made coffee, showered, and by 7 o'clock was in his truck heading to the Millerton County Records office. The building was a squat brick structure behind the courthouse, its interior smelling of old paper and floor wax. Cal waited at the counter until a woman emerged from the back room. She was maybe 58, with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck and a name tag that read Irene Kowalski. "Help you?" she asked, her tone neither friendly nor unfriendly. Cal slid the deeds across the counter. "I need to verify these, see if they're registered." Irene picked up the first deed, studied it briefly, then looked at Cal with new interest. "These are old. 1,946 to 1,948. She carried them to a computer terminal and began typing. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, her eyes scanning the screen. After several minutes, she looked up. "What's the owner's name?" "Harold Remer." "My grandfather." More typing. A long pause. Irene frowned, adjusted her glasses, typed again. "I'm not finding anything under Remer. What's the parcel number?" "I don't know if there is one. These were never registered with the county." Irene's frown deepened. "If they weren't registered, then legally—" "They're still valid deeds," Cal interrupted. "The transactions were witnessed and notarized." "Maybe, but without county registration, there's no official record of ownership. Anyone could have claimed this land over the past 70 years. Adverse possession, tax default, any number of things." She slid the deeds back across the counter. "You need a surveyor to verify the property still exists as described, and you need a title attorney to establish legal ownership. Even then, if someone else has been paying taxes on it or using it openly for 20 years or more, they might have a stronger claim than you do." Cal felt his brief hope beginning to crack. "How do I find out if someone's claimed it?" "Tax records. I can check if anyone's been paying property tax on land matching these descriptions." She took the deeds again and disappeared into the back room. Cal waited, listening to the sound of filing cabinets opening and closing, the rustle of paper, the murmur of Irene's voice as she spoke to someone else in the office. 20 minutes passed. When she returned, she carried a printout and wore an expression Cal couldn't quite read. "Nothing," she said. "No tax payments on record for any parcel matching these descriptions. No ownership claims filed. According to county records, this land doesn't exist." She paused. "Which either means the boundaries have changed so much we can't match them, or nobody's touched it in 75 years. Is that possible?" "Possible, sure. Likely?" She shrugged. "There's a lot of land in this county that fell through the cracks over the years. Old surveys that don't match modern GPS, parcels that got forgotten when families died out or moved away. If your grandfather deliberately kept this quiet and nobody stumbled onto it since, then yeah, it could have just sat there all this time." Cal gathered the deeds carefully. "What's my next step?" "Get a surveyor. Find the actual land. Make sure the boundaries in these deeds correspond to real property. If they do, hire a title attorney and file a quiet title action to establish legal ownership. It'll take time and money, but if everything checks out, the land could be yours." Outside, Cal sat in his truck and studied the crude map he'd sketched from the deed descriptions, northwest of Millerton, along Kettle Creek. He knew the general area mostly wooded, undeveloped, the kind of land that had never been valuable enough to fight over. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed northwest. The road narrowed as he left town, pavement giving way to gravel. He passed a few scattered houses, an abandoned gas station, a stretch of state forest. After about 3 miles, the road curved alongside a creek. Kettle Creek, probably, though there was no sign to confirm it. Cal pulled onto the shoulder and got out. The land rolled away in gentle hills, covered in oak and maple, the underbrush thick with autumn gone dormant. He walked into the trees, checking his rough map against the landscape. There should be survey markers, iron pins driven into the ground decades ago, but finding them would take expertise he didn't have. Still, standing there among the trees, Cal felt something. The land was beautiful, untouched, quiet, the kind of place that had probably looked the same for centuries. He understood suddenly why Harold had wanted to preserve it. This wasn't about profit or investment. This was about keeping something wild and free in a world that commodified everything. He walked deeper into the woods, following the creek sound. The water ran clear over smooth stones, the banks lined with ferns still green despite the season. Birds called from the canopy. A deer trail crossed his path, the tracks fresh in the soft earth. Cal spent an hour exploring before returning to his truck. He sat behind the wheel, engine off, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Pete Gannon, a surveyor who'd done work for Cal's construction company years ago. Pete was semi-retired now, but he agreed to come look at the property for a reduced rate out of respect for Harold, he said. The second call was to a lawyer. Cal didn't know many attorneys, but he remembered Lloyd Hutchins from the Rotary Club meetings he'd attended back when his business was thriving. Lloyd was in his 70s now, mostly doing estate work. When Cal explained the situation, Lloyd was quiet for a long moment. "This could get complicated," Lloyd finally said, "but it's interesting. Bring the deeds by my office tomorrow. Let's see what we're dealing with." Cal hung up and started the engine. As he pulled back onto the road, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a black SUV parked about 100 yards back, partially hidden by trees. It hadn't been there when he'd arrived. He slowed, watching, but the SUV didn't move, just someone else enjoying the scenery, probably. Still, as Cal drove back toward town, he couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather's secret wasn't as private as he'd thought. Pete Gannon arrived at Cal's trailer 3 days later, driving a pickup truck loaded with surveying equipment. He was 67, lean and weathered, with white hair and hands that still moved with the precision of a craftsman. He'd known Harold from the VFW post, though they'd never been close friends. "Your grandfather was a good man," Pete said as they shook hands. "Kept to himself, but always straight. If he says he bought land, he bought land." They drove out to Kettle Creek together, Pete studying the deeds while Cal navigated the gravel roads. When they reached the area Cal had scouted, Pete got out and stood silent for several minutes, reading the landscape like a book written in contours and vegetation. "These old surveys used natural markers," Pete explained. "Trees, rocks, creek bends. Problem is, trees die, rocks get moved, creeks change course. We'll need to find the iron pins if they're still there. Then verify the boundaries match what's written here." They spent the rest of the morning walking the property. Pete used a metal detector to search for survey markers, occasionally stopping to take measurements with a handheld GPS unit. The work was slow and methodical. By noon, they'd found 2 old iron pins, both exactly where the deeds suggested they should be. "So far, so good," Pete said, making notes on a pad. "But we need to walk the entire perimeter. That'll take a few days." Cal nodded. "Whatever it takes." They broke for lunch, sitting on a fallen log near the creek. Pete unwrapped a sandwich and ate in silence for a while, then said, "You know, your grandfather and I had a conversation once. Must have been 20 years ago. We were both at the VFW hall for a fish fry, and he'd had a couple beers, which was rare for Harold. He started talking about Europe during the war. He never talked about the war with me," Cal said. "He didn't with most people. But that night, he told me about seeing towns where people had lost everything, not just possessions, land, history, proof they'd ever existed, records burned, deeds destroyed, whole communities erased. He said it made him understand that ownership is fragile. It only exists as long as someone remembers it and can prove it." Cal thought about the hidden deeds, the secret ledger. That's why he kept this quiet. He wanted something that couldn't be erased. "Maybe," Pete said, "or maybe he was just scared of losing it if people knew about it. Fear makes us do strange things." He finished his sandwich and stood. "Come on. Let's find the rest of those markers." Over the next 3 days, Pete surveyed the entire property. Cal joined him when he could, learning to read the landscape the way Pete did, seeing the subtle signs of old boundaries. They found 7 of the original 9 survey markers. The 2 missing ones had probably been destroyed over the decades, but Pete could interpolate their locations from the others. On the 4th evening, Pete spread his findings across Cal's kitchen table. He'd created a modern survey map, overlaying the original deed descriptions. The boundaries matched almost perfectly. "It's all here," Pete said. 127 acres, give or take an acre for survey variance. The land exists exactly as described in those deeds. Nobody's built on it, Nobody's cleared it, nobody's even posted it. Far as I can tell, it's been sitting empty since your grandfather bought it. Cal stared at the map, still struggling to believe it was real. What's it worth? Pete shrugged. Depends on what someone wants to do with it. For farming? Not much. The soil's rocky, and it's too remote for equipment access. For logging? Maybe 50,000, but you'd destroy the land in the process. For development? He paused. That's where it gets interesting. This land sits right on the edge of where Millerton is growing. If the town expands northwest, this could be prime residential property, could be worth millions. Millions, Cal repeated, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. Of course, first you have to establish legal ownership. That's where your lawyer comes in. Cal had already met with Lloyd Hutchins twice. The attorney had examined the deeds carefully, researched the relevant laws, and outlined a path forward. They needed to file a quiet title action, a lawsuit asking the court to recognize Cal's ownership and eliminate any other potential claims. It would require publishing legal notices, waiting for anyone with competing claims to come forward, and eventually getting a judge to rule in their favor. It'll take 6 months minimum, Lloyd had said, maybe longer. And it'll cost you about $5,000 in legal fees, though I can work with you on payment. $5,000. Cal didn't have $5,000. He barely had $500. But Lloyd had agreed to take the case on a contingency basis. If the land proved valuable and Cal eventually sold it, Lloyd would take his fee from the proceeds. It was a risk for both of them, but Lloyd seemed to believe the risk was worth it. The problem was, Cal wasn't sure he wanted to sell. He tried calling Penny that evening, wanting to share the news with someone, needing to talk through his confusion. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice tired. "Hey, Dad, can I call you back? I'm in the middle of dinner with Iris." "Sure." It's not urgent. But she didn't call back. Cal tried Graham next, got voicemail, left a message. Graham returned the call 3 hours later, sounding distracted. "What's up, Dad?" Cal started to explain about the land, the deeds, what it might mean. Halfway through, Graham interrupted. "Wait, you're saying Grandpa Harold left you land worth potentially millions?" "Maybe. We don't know yet. I have to establish ownership first. But if it's real, Dad, this could change everything. You could pay off debts, help me with my startup, help Penny. This is huge." Cal heard the excitement in his son's voice, the immediate calculation of what the land could become. It made something tighten in his chest. "I'm not sure I want to sell it," Cal said quietly. Silence on the other end. Then Graham laughed, though it didn't sound amused. "You're joking. Your grandfather kept this land secret for 75 years. He had his reasons." "His reasons?" "Dad, his reasons don't pay your rent. They don't fix your truck or put food in your fridge. You've been broke my entire life, and now you finally have a chance to change that, and you're talking about some sentimental bullshit." "Graham, no, listen. I love you, but you've got to be practical for once. This is a gift. Don't waste it trying to figure out what Grandpa would have wanted. He's dead. You're alive. Use it." The call ended shortly after, leaving Cal sitting in his trailer with the phone still in his hand and his son's words echoing in his head. That night, Cal drove back out to the land. He parked on the shoulder and walked into the trees with a flashlight, following the creek until he reached the approximate center of the property. He turned off the flashlight and stood in the darkness, listening to the water, the wind, the small sounds of nocturnal animals moving through the underbrush. Graham was right. This land could solve every financial problem Cal had. It could give him security, help his children, maybe even rebuild some of the bridges he'd burned over the years. But standing there in the dark, Cal felt the weight of his grandfather's trust. Harold had protected this land for 3/4 of a century. He'd kept it secret, kept it safe, and finally passed that responsibility to Cal. The question was whether Cal was worthy of that trust, or just another person who'd sell out the moment the price was right? He didn't have an answer yet. When Cal returned to his truck, he noticed the black SUV again, parked in the same spot as before, lights off. This time, when he drove past it, he slowed and looked directly at it. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but he felt certain someone was watching. He made note of the license plate and continued home, his unease growing. 2 days later, a man knocked on Cal's trailer door. He was middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the trailer park. He introduced himself as Chuck Bellamy, Cal's neighbor from 2 lots over, though they'd never spoken before. "Got a minute?" Chuck asked, his smile friendly but his eyes calculating. Cal invited him in, offered coffee, sensed immediately that this wasn't a social call. Chuck sat at the kitchen table and got straight to the point. "Word around town is you've come into some property, your grandfather's land." "News travels fast," Cal said. "Small town." Chuck shrugged. "Look, I'll be straight with you. I've been approached by some developers. They're buying up land in this area, putting together a big residential project. They're paying well, very well. I sold them 40 acres last month for 3 times what I thought it was worth. Good for you. The thing is, they're still looking for parcels. When I mentioned you might have land in the area, they were very interested. Asked me to feel you out, see if you might be open to selling." Cal set his coffee down carefully. "I haven't even established legal ownership yet, but when you do, would you be interested?" "I don't know." Chuck leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Cal, I know you've had some tough years. We all have. These developers, they're serious people with serious money. If your grandfather's land is where I think it is, they'll pay top dollar. You could walk away with enough to retire comfortably, set up your kids, really live for the first time in years." "Who are these developers?" "Company called Consolidated Properties Group. They're out of Pittsburgh, done projects all over western Pennsylvania. Professional outfit, everything above board." Cal stood, signaling the conversation was over. "I appreciate the information, Chuck, but I'm not making any decisions until I know what I'm dealing with." Chuck stood too, his smile never wavering. "Of course. Just wanted to make sure you knew the opportunity was there. Don't wait too long, though. These guys move fast, and if they find other land that works for their project, the offer might not be on the table anymore." After Chuck left, Cal sat alone in his trailer and tried to ignore the feeling that his grandfather's secret was unraveling faster than he could control. Cal spent the next morning at the Millerton Public Library, hunched over a microfilm reader in the basement research room. The machine hummed and clicked as he scrolled through digitized land records from the 1,940 seconds, searching for any mention of J.K. Sutton. He found the obituary in the 14th of September, 1979 edition of the Millerton Gazette. Joseph Kenneth Sutton, age 87, died peacefully at home, survived by no immediate family. Services, private. In lieu of flowers, donations to the Millerton Historical Society. Cal printed the obituary and continued searching. He found scattered references to Sutton in real estate transactions throughout the 40s and 50s, a speculator who'd bought cheap during the Depression and sold parcels gradually over the following decades. Sutton appeared to have been exactly what Harold's ledger suggested, a businessman liquidating assets, nothing more. The question that gnawed at Cal was why Harold had paid in cash, why he'd never registered the deeds. The more Cal researched post-war land transactions, the more he realized his grandfather's approach had been unusual but not unique. Several properties in the area had been purchased by returning veterans with military savings, some never formally recorded. It was a different time, a different way of thinking about ownership and privacy. Cal was gathering his papers when his phone buzzed. Graham calling again. "Dad, I've been thinking about what we discussed. I know I came on strong the other night, but I really think you should consider the financial angle here. I've got a business opportunity that could—" "Graham, I can't talk about this right now." You can't or you won't, because there's a difference. Look, I need 20,000 to keep my startup afloat. Just a loan, I'll pay you back when... I don't have 20,000. I don't have anything yet. The land isn't even legally mine, but it will be. And when it is, you could help your own son instead of sitting on some sentimental... Cal ended the call. His hands were shaking slightly. He loved his son, but Graham had a way of turning every conversation into a transaction, every relationship into leverage. It made Cal tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. That afternoon, Cal drove to the town hall for a meeting with the planning commissioner. The building was old brick, its interior smelling of floor polish and bureaucracy. He found Faye Dunbar in a cramped office on the second floor, surrounded by filing cabinets and zoning maps. Faye was 52, competent and direct. She'd been planning commissioner for 6 years and knew every development project in the county. When Cal explained why he was there, she pulled out a large map of Millerton and the surrounding area. "You're asking about Consolidated Properties Group," she said, pointing to several highlighted parcels. "They've been very active lately. Started buying land about 18 months ago. The project is called Millerton Meadows, 600 residential units, mixed single-family and townhomes, retail space, community centre, big development." Cal studied the map. The highlighted parcels formed an irregular shape northwest of town, surrounding what appeared to be a gap that corresponded roughly to where his grandfather's land should be. "What's this empty space?" he asked, though he already knew. "That's the interesting part. CPG has acquired almost everything they need, but there's one parcel they can't account for. According to their surveys, there's land there, but no ownership record. They've been trying to track down who owns it or if it's available for adverse possession claim. What if someone establishes ownership?" Faye looked at him carefully. "Then CPG would need to negotiate with that owner. Without that parcel, their development loses significant value. The layout doesn't work as well, the density drops, the whole project becomes less viable." She paused. "Is this about your grandfather's land?" Cal didn't answer directly. "Can I see the public records of CPG's purchases?" Faye pulled a thick folder from a filing cabinet. "It's all public information, purchase prices, dates, sellers. Feel free to look through it." Cal spent an hour reviewing the documents. CPG had paid fair prices, good prices, actually for most parcels. But he noticed a pattern in the more recent transactions. Elderly sellers, properties sold quickly, some within weeks of first contact. There were also letters in the file, correspondence between CPG and landowners who'd initially refused to sell. The letters were professionally worded but carried an undertone of pressure, concerns about upcoming property tax increases, hints about eminent domain possibilities, suggestions that refusing to sell now might mean settling for less later. Nothing explicitly illegal, but it left Cal uneasy. "They play hardball," Faye said, noticing his expression. "Within legal bounds, but they're aggressive. They want this project to happen, and they're not accustomed to obstacles." Cal thanked her and left with copies of the public records. Walking to his truck, he noticed Chuck Bellamy across the street, talking on his phone while watching Cal. Their eyes met briefly before Chuck turned away. That evening, Cal returned to his trailer to find a notice taped to his door. The trailer park management was raising rent by $200 a month, starting in 60 days. For tenants unable to pay, eviction proceedings would begin after 90 days. Cal read the notice twice, then crumpled it in his fist. $200 might not sound like much to some people, but for him, it was the difference between making it and not making it. He was already behind on his truck payment, already cutting corners on groceries. An extra $200 a month was impossible. He went inside and called the park manager, got voicemail, left a message requesting a meeting to discuss the increase. Then he sat at his kitchen table with his head in his hands, feeling the walls closing in. His phone rang. Penny this time. "Dad, sorry I didn't call you back the other night. Things have been crazy." What did you want to talk about? Cal explained everything, the deeds, the land, the developers, the pressure mounting from multiple directions. Penny listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Do you trust these developer people?" she finally asked. "No." "Then don't sell to them. Not yet, anyway. Figure out what the land is really worth, what your options are. Don't let anyone rush you into a decision because they're waving money around. Graham thinks I'm being foolish. Graham thinks everything is about money. He always has." Her voice softened. "Dad, I know we haven't been close lately. That's partly my fault. But I remember Grandpa Harold. I remember he was a careful man, a thoughtful man. If he hid this land for 75 years, he had a reason. Maybe you should figure out what that reason was before you decide what to do with it." After they hung up, Cal felt marginally better. Penny had given him something Graham couldn't permission to take his time, to make a decision based on more than desperation. But that night, lying in bed, Cal couldn't sleep. The walls of his trailer felt thin, the darkness oppressive. He kept thinking about the black SUV, about Chuck's unexpected visit, about the convenient timing of his rent increase. Maybe he was being paranoid, or maybe he was finally paying attention. At 2 in the morning, he got up and checked his door lock. Then he wedged a chair under the knob and went back to bed with his phone on the nightstand. 911 already dialed, except for the final digit. 3 days later, Cal was leaving the grocery store when he found an envelope tucked under his windshield wiper. Plain white, no markings. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Don't make trouble, take the easy way. Some things aren't worth fighting for." Cal looked around the parking lot. A dozen cars, a few people loading groceries, nothing obviously suspicious. He folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he drove to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Roy Pritchard was 61, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by 3 decades of rural law enforcement. He'd gone to high school with Cal, played football together, lost touch over the years, but maintained a cordial relationship when their paths crossed. Cal showed him the note. Roy read it, frowned, read it again. "Any idea who sent this? Probably related to some land I'm trying to claim. There are developers interested in the area." "Consolidated Properties? You know them?" Roy leaned back in his chair. "I know of them. They're not local, but they've been around enough that we're aware of them. Professional outfit on the surface, but we've had a few complaints, nothing we could act on. Intimidation is hard to prove when it's subtle. So there's nothing you can do. I can make a report, which I will, and I can tell you to be careful. If someone's trying to scare you off, it means you have something they want. That can go one of 2 ways. Either they'll give up and move on, or they'll escalate. My advice? Document everything. Keep copies of all your papers somewhere safe. If anything else happens, any threats, any suspicious activity, you call me immediately." Cal left the sheriff's office feeling only slightly reassured. He drove home through the early evening, checking his rear-view mirror more than usual. When he pulled into the trailer park, everything looked normal. But when he unlocked his door and stepped inside, he knew immediately something was wrong. Nothing obvious, nothing stolen or broken. But his papers had been moved. The deeds and documents he'd left on the kitchen table were slightly out of order. A drawer he'd left closed was open an inch. Someone had been here, searching through his things, trying to be careful but not careful enough. Cal stood in his doorway, anger and fear mixing in his chest. He called Roy Pritchard again, reported the break-in. The sheriff came personally, took notes, dusted for prints, found nothing useful. "They're professionals," Roy said. "Knew how to get in without leaving evidence. Probably looking to see what documentation you have, how strong your claim is." After Roy left, Cal gathered all his important papers, the deeds, the ledger, the letter, Pete's survey notes, and put them in a waterproof bag. Then he drove to Pete Gannon's house and asked him to keep the documents safe. Pete agreed without hesitation, putting the bag in his floor safe and promising not to open it unless Cal gave explicit permission. "You're in deeper than you thought," Pete said as Cal was leaving. "I'm starting to realize that. Be smart, Cal. Whatever this land is worth, it's not worth your life." Driving home, Cal thought about Pete's words. The smart thing would be to take CPG's offer, walk away with whatever money they'd give him, solve his immediate problems, and move on. That's what Graham wanted. That's what Chuck had suggested. That's what the anonymous note implied he should do. But Cal kept thinking about his grandfather, keeping this secret for 75 years, protecting something he believed mattered. Harold had been many things: quiet, careful, sometimes stubborn, but he'd never been a coward. He'd stormed beaches in Normandy. He'd seen the worst humanity could offer and come home determined to build something better. Cal wasn't sure he had his grandfather's courage. But sitting in his trailer that night, with a chair wedged against the door and his truck keys in his pocket in case he needed to leave quickly, he made a decision. He wasn't selling. Not yet. Not until he understood what he really had and what his grandfather had really intended. Whatever came next, he'd face it standing up. The abandoned farmhouse sat at the eastern edge of what Cal now thought of as his property, though the legal claim was still pending. He'd noticed it during one of Pete's surveys, a sagging structure mostly hidden by overgrown lilacs and wild grapevines, its clapboard siding weathered to silver grey. Cal had been thinking about it for days, wondering if it might hold answers. Harold's letter mentioned buying the land, but not whether anything had been on it when he purchased it. The house looked old enough to predate Harold's ownership, possibly built in the late 1800s. If Harold had ever spent time there, he might have left something behind. It was trespassing, technically, until Cal's ownership was legally established. But the house was on land, he was claiming, land that appeared on his grandfather's deeds. That was justification enough. He drove out on a grey Saturday morning, parked where the old access road had mostly disappeared into grass and brush, and walked the quarter-mile to the house. The front porch sagged dangerously, so he went around to the back door. The knob turned easily, no lock, or the lock had rusted away decades ago. Inside, the air was thick with dust and abandonment. The floor creaked under his weight but held. He moved carefully through the kitchen, where a cast-iron sink still clung to the wall and ancient linoleum curled at the edges. Through to a sitting room, empty except for a broken rocking chair. Up a narrow staircase to the second floor, where 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom waited in varying states of decay. In the larger bedroom, Cal found what he was looking for, an old steamer trunk pushed against the far wall, partially hidden by a fallen section of ceiling plaster. The trunk was locked, but the hasp was rusted. Cal used a screwdriver from his truck to pry it open. The trunk smelled of mildew and time. Inside were clothes, work shirts, dungarees, all moth-eaten and useless. Beneath the clothes, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. Cal carried it to the window where the light was better and opened it carefully. The pages were brittle but legible. The handwriting was unmistakably Harold's, though younger, less steady than the writing on the letter. The first entry was dated the 15th of March, 1946. Asterisk, bought the first parcel today, 42 acres along the creek. Paid Sutton $250, first installment. He thinks I'm a fool. Maybe I am. But I've seen what happens when men have nothing they can truly call their own. I saw it in France, in Belgium, in Germany. Families with centuries of history erased in an afternoon. I won't let that happen to mine. Asterisk. Cal turned pages slowly, reading his grandfather's private thoughts. The entries were sporadic, sometimes daily, sometimes weeks apart. They chronicled Harold's life after the war, working at the garage, courting the woman who would become Cal's grandmother, buying the parcels piece by piece. But they also revealed something deeper. Harold had nightmares. He struggled with anger. He found peace in the land, in working with his hands, in the quiet of the woods. The journal entries became less frequent after 1948, as if Harold had found some measure of equilibrium and no longer needed to pour his thoughts onto paper. One entry from August 1947 stopped Cal cold. Asterisk, Sarah asked where the money was going. I told her I was paying off tools for the garage. I hate lying to her, but she wouldn't understand. She'd want to build on the land, develop it, make it productive. She doesn't see that some things have value precisely because they're left alone. The land isn't an investment. It's insurance against a world that takes everything. Asterisk. Cal read the passage twice. His grandmother, he barely remembered her. She died when he was 7, had been kept in the dark too. Harold's secrecy ran deeper than Cal had realized. This wasn't just about protecting the land from outside threats. It was about protecting it from well-meaning family members who might want to use it, change it, profit from it. Another entry from January 1948. Asterisk, saw Sutton at the feed store today. He asked if I was going to do anything with the land. I told him maybe someday. Truth is, I hope I never have to. The land serves its purpose by simply existing. Someday, when everything else fails, someone in my family might need it, not for what they can extract from it, but for what it represents, a place that can't be taken, taxed into oblivion, or foreclosed on. As long as no one knows about it, it's safe. Asterisk. Cal closed the journal and sat on the dusty floor, his back against the wall. Harold hadn't been hiding the land for mysterious reasons. He'd been hiding it because he understood that public knowledge meant public pressure. Ownership meant taxes, regulations, expectations. Secrecy meant preservation. His grandfather had created a kind of emergency reserve, not for money, but for dignity. A place the family could turn to when everything else was lost. And Cal, broke and desperate in his trailer, was exactly the situation Harold had anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on him. Harold had protected the land, so his descendants would have options in hard times. But exercising those options meant revealing what Harold had kept hidden, which would inevitably lead to pressure to sell, develop, or change what Harold had wanted to preserve. Cal's phone buzzed. A text from Lloyd Hutchins. Asterisk, title search complete. No competing claims found. Ready to file quiet title action when you are. Call me Monday. Asterisk. Good news, but it brought the decision closer. Once Cal filed the quiet title action, the land would become public knowledge. Legal notices would be published. Anyone interested, including Consolidated Properties Group, would know exactly what Cal had and where it was. He tucked the journal under his arm and left the farmhouse. Walking back to his truck, he noticed the black SUV again, parked on the shoulder about 200 yards away. This time, Cal drove directly toward it instead of away. As he approached, the SUV's engine started and it pulled onto the road, heading in the opposite direction. Cal got close enough to confirm the license plate, same vehicle he'd seen before. Back at Pete's house, Cal added the journal to the waterproof bag. Pete read a few entries, his expression somber. Your grandfather was carrying a lot, Pete said. War does that. Some men come home and drink, some work themselves to death. Some find their own ways to cope. Harold's way was that land. It was his therapy. What would you do? Cal asked. If you were me. Pete thought for a long moment. I'd ask myself what Harold would want me to do. Not what he'd say if he were here, what he'd genuinely want. Deep down. And then I'd do that. Consequences be damned. That evening, Cal called a family meeting. He texted both Penny and Graham, asking them to come to Millerton on Sunday. Penny agreed immediately. Graham said he'd try, which meant he probably wouldn't show up. But Sunday afternoon, both of them arrived at Cal's trailer within minutes of each other. Penny looked tired, her scrubs suggesting she'd come straight from a shift. Graham wore expensive jeans and a designer jacket, looking uncomfortable in the trailer park setting. Cal had cleared his small living room, set out coffee, prepared himself for a difficult conversation. When they were both seated, he laid everything out on the coffee table, the deeds, Harold's letter, pages photocopied from the journal, Pete's survey results, Lloyd's legal assessment. "This is what Grandpa left us," Cal said. "Not just the land, but the responsibility of deciding what to do with it." Graham picked up the survey results, immediately calculating 127 acres. If CPG is willing to pay what Chuck suggested, we're talking minimum 2 million, possibly 3. "It's not about the money," Cal said. "Of course it's about the money. Dad, you're broke. Penny's struggling. I've got debts. This land could fix everything." Penny was reading Harold's letter, her eyes moving slowly across the page. When she finished, she looked up at Cal. "Why did he keep it secret from Grandma, from Dad, from everyone?" Cal explained what he'd learned from the journal, about Harold's fears and motivations, about his view of the land as a sanctuary rather than an asset. As he spoke, he watched his children's reactions. Graham grew increasingly frustrated, checking his phone, shifting impatiently. Penny listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "So he wanted it preserved," Penny said when Cal finished. "He wanted it to stay wild." "That's what I think, yes." Graham stood up, pacing the small room. "Okay, but here's the thing. Grandpa's dead. He doesn't get a vote anymore. We're alive. We have actual problems that actual money could solve. Why should we honor the wishes of someone who's not here to explain himself?" "Because he trusted us," Penny said quietly. "He could have sold this land himself any time over the past 75 years. Could have used the money for his own struggles. But he didn't. He kept it safe and passed it to us. That means something." "It means he was stubborn and irrational," Graham shot back. "Look at where that got him, dead in a rundown farmhouse with nothing to show for a lifetime of work." Cal felt anger flare. "Your grandfather was a better man than you'll ever be, if that's how you think of him." The room went silent. Graham's face flushed. Penny looked between them, uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," Graham said finally, though his tone suggested he wasn't. "But I came here thinking we'd discuss selling the land and dividing the proceeds. Instead, you're talking about some sentimental mission to preserve wilderness or whatever. That's fine for people with money in the bank. We don't have that luxury." "The land isn't legally mine yet," Cal said. "When it is, if it is, I'll decide what happens to it. This meeting was to inform you, not to ask permission." Graham stared at his father. "You're seriously going to throw away millions because of a dead man's paranoia about governments and banks?" "I'm going to take time to make the right decision." "The right decision is obvious. Sell it. Take the money. Move on with your life." Penny stood, positioning herself between them. "Graham, stop. Dad's right. This isn't a decision that should be rushed." She turned to Cal. "But Dad, you also need to be realistic. If you keep the land, what does that mean practically? Can you afford to pay property taxes once it's registered? Can you manage it, protect it, deal with developers and pressure? Good intentions don't pay bills." "I know that." "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're barely keeping your head above water now. Adding the responsibility of 127 acres might drown you." They talked for another hour, the conversation circular and increasingly tense. Graham wanted immediate action toward a sale. Penny wanted caution and time. Cal wanted to honor his grandfather's intent without fully understanding what that meant. Finally, Graham left, slamming the trailer door behind him. Penny lingered, helping Cal clean up the coffee cups. "He's not wrong about the practical concerns," she said gently, "but neither are you about the principle. I just hope you figure out which matters more before you lose both." After Penny left, Cal sat alone in his trailer as darkness fell. He thought about Harold, alone in that farmhouse with his journal and his secrets. He thought about his own children, divided over money and meaning. He thought about the land itself, sitting quiet and wild, unaware it had become the center of a family's unraveling. His phone rang, an unknown number. Cal almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Remer. A man's voice, distorted, as if speaking through a cloth. You should reconsider your options. The land isn't worth what you'll lose trying to keep it. Who is this? The line went dead. Cal sat holding the phone, his hand trembling slightly. The threats were escalating. First the note, then the break-in, now a phone call. Someone was getting impatient. He called Roy Pritchard, reported the call. Roy said he'd add it to the file, but there wasn't much he could do without more evidence. That night, Cal didn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to every sound, wondering if the person who'd broken in before would come back, wondering if he was being foolish, risking his safety for land he'd never known existed a month ago. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered Harold's words in the journal, asterisk, a place that can't be taken, insurance against a world that takes everything, asterisk. His grandfather had fought in a war to protect such places. Cal could at least fight through his fear to preserve this one. Lloyd Hutchins called on Monday morning with news that made Cal's stomach drop. He'd discovered something in the original deeds that neither of them had noticed before a handwritten clause on the third parcel, partially obscured by a water stain, but still legible under magnification. It says the land is to remain undeveloped for agricultural use in perpetuity, Lloyd explained. It's a restrictive covenant, signed by both Harold and Sutton, legally binding. What does that mean? It means if you wanted to sell to developers, they couldn't build residential properties. The covenant runs with the land. It doesn't matter who owns it. The restriction stays in place. Cal sat down heavily. So even if I wanted to sell to CPG, they couldn't use it for their development? Not for housing, no. They could potentially use it for farming or conservation, but that's not what they're after. This covenant significantly reduces the land's commercial value. Lloyd paused. It also means CPG probably doesn't know about this restriction yet, or they wouldn't be pursuing it so aggressively. Should I tell them? That's up to you. But once they find out, and they will during due diligence if you entered negotiations, they'll likely withdraw their interest entirely. The land becomes worthless to them. After hanging up, Cal sat at his kitchen table, trying to process this new information. Harold hadn't just hidden the land, he'd legally restricted what could be done with it. Another layer of protection, another way of ensuring the land stayed wild. But it also meant Cal's financial salvation had just evaporated. The land had value, but not the millions Graham had been counting on. Not the transformative wealth that could have solved everyone's problems. He needed to see the land again, needed to stand on it and think. He drove out to Kettle Creek, parked, and walked into the trees. It was a cold November morning, the sky grey and heavy with the promise of rain. The creek ran high from recent storms, its water brown and turbulent. Cal followed the old deer trail deeper into the property. He'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when he heard voices, young voices, laughing. He moved quietly toward the sound and found two people in their 20s, both wearing hiking boots and carrying backpacks, standing near a small clearing. They noticed him approaching and tensed slightly. Cal raised a hand in greeting. "Morning, I'm Cal Remer. This is my land, or it will be, legally, soon." The young woman relaxed. "Oh, you're the owner. We heard someone was claiming this property. I'm sorry. We've been hiking here for years. We didn't know it was private. How long have you been coming here?" "Since college," the young man said. 5-6 years now. There's a trail system through here that connects to state forest land. It's one of the few places around Millerton that's still completely undeveloped." They introduced themselves. The woman was Chloe, a teacher, and the man was her boyfriend Zeke, who worked in IT. They hiked the property regularly, had brought friends, used it as an escape from town. They assumed it was public land or abandoned property. "It's beautiful here," Chloe said, "especially in spring when the wildflowers bloom. We've seen deer, foxes, even a black bear once. And there are birds. Some rare species nest here." "What kind of birds?" Zeke pulled out his phone and showed Cal photos he'd taken over the years. That's a cerulean warbler. They're endangered. This is one of the few places in the county where they still breed. And this one, he swiped to another photo, that's a golden-winged warbler, also threatened. Cal looked at the images, these small, bright creatures that had found sanctuary on his grandfather's hidden land. Do you know much about environmental protections? Some, Chloe said. Why? If endangered species are nesting here, does that affect what can be done with the land? Absolutely. The Endangered Species Act provides protection. Any development that would harm critical habitat could be blocked. She looked at him carefully. Are you planning to develop this land? No. But there are people who want to. Zeke and Chloe exchanged glances. Consolidated properties? Zeke asked. Cal nodded. You know about them? Everyone who hikes here knows about them. They've been buying up land all around this area. We figured it was only a matter of time before they got this parcel too. Chloe's voice carried genuine distress. If they develop here, it'll destroy the habitat corridor. The birds won't have anywhere to go. Cal asked if they'd be willing to document the bird species they'd seen, maybe reach out to environmental groups who might be interested in the land's ecological value. Both agreed enthusiastically, promising to send Cal everything they had. Walking back to his truck, Cal felt a strange sense of clarity forming. The land had protected itself. In a way, Harold's restrictive covenant, the endangered birds, the lack of any record or claim for 75 years, it was as if the property had its own defense system, waiting for the right moment to reveal each layer of protection. That afternoon, Carlton Voss called Cal's cell phone directly. His voice was smooth, professional, with an undertone of steel. Mr. Remer, I think it's time we met in person. There's been a lot of speculation and rumor. I'd like to clear the air, discuss the opportunity Consolidated Properties can offer you. I'm not interested in selling. I understand you might feel that way now. But I think once you hear our full proposal, you'll reconsider. We're prepared to be very generous. Can I take you to lunch tomorrow? 1 hour of your time, that's all I ask. Something in Voss's tone made Cal agree. He wanted to see who he was dealing with, wanted to understand the pressure that had been building from shadows and anonymous threats. They met at Morrison's, the nicest restaurant in Millerton, which wasn't saying much, but it had white tablecloths and a wine list. Voss arrived in a dark suit, perfectly tailored, and shook Cal's hand with practiced warmth. He was 45, fit, with the kind of confidence that came from winning more often than losing. Over lunch, Voss laid out his proposal. $2.8 million for the land, cash payment, closing within 60 days. He painted a picture of what Millerton Meadows would become a vibrant community, hundreds of families, economic growth, jobs, tax revenue. He spoke about Cal's opportunity to be part of something bigger than himself, to leave a legacy of growth rather than stagnation. Your grandfather held on to this land for 75 years, Voss said. That's admirable in its way. But times change. Millerton is dying, Mr. Remer. You can see it yourself. Empty shops, declining population, young people leaving. Our development would breathe new life into this town, and you'd be compensated very well for making that possible. Cal set down his fork. The land has a restrictive covenant, agricultural use only. Your development wouldn't be permitted. Voss's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes. Restrictive covenants can be challenged, modified through court proceedings. It's a minor complication, not an insurmountable obstacle. It's also a protected habitat for endangered birds. Federal law would block development. Now Voss's smile did fade slightly. Where did you hear that? From people who've been documenting the wildlife here for years. Voss was quiet for a moment, reassessing. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone from his voice. Mr. Remer, let me be direct. We've invested significant time and money into this project. We've acquired dozens of parcels, secured permits, lined up financing. Your property is the final piece. We will get it, one way or another. The question is whether you profit from that inevitability or make things difficult for yourself. Is that a threat? It's reality. We can work together, or we can work around you. Working together is considerably more pleasant and profitable for everyone involved. Cal stood up. I'm not selling. Not to you, not to anyone. And if the harassment continues, the break-ins, the threatening calls, the intimidation, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of company Consolidated Properties is. Voss remained seated, his expression cold now. You're making a mistake. A very expensive mistake. Maybe. But it's my mistake to make. Cal left the restaurant, his heart pounding but his resolve hardened. Whatever consequences came from refusing Voss, he'd face them. Some things were more important than money or safety. That evening, Irene Kowalski stopped by Cal's trailer unannounced. She looked uncomfortable, checking over her shoulder before stepping inside. I probably shouldn't be here, she said, but I thought you should know CPG has been donating heavily to Mayor Kowalski's re-election campaign. My brother. She said it with distaste. They've also made contributions to several town council members. They have political influence here, Cal, more than you might realize. Why are you telling me this? Because I watched my parents lose their farm in the 80s. Eminent domain, they called it. Public good. A highway that was supposed to bring prosperity. It brought nothing but heartache. She handed Cal a folder. These are records of CPG's projects in other towns. I did some digging. They have a pattern-aggressive acquisition, political pressure, and when necessary, they've successfully petitioned for eminent domain takings. They claim economic development qualifies as public use. Cal opened the folder. Inside were newspaper articles, court records, documentation of CPG's tactics across western Pennsylvania. In 3 different towns, they'd used eminent domain to acquire holdout properties. The legal challenges had failed. The landowners had lost. They're going to try that here, Cal said. I think so, especially now that you've refused to sell. Gene, my brother, is sympathetic to their arguments about economic development. He's not a bad man, but he's practical. If CPG convinces the council that your land is all that stands between Millerton and prosperity, they'll vote for eminent domain. Can they do that legally? The Supreme Court has upheld eminent domain for economic development in some cases. It's controversial, but it's possible, especially in a small town with political connections. Irene moved toward the door. I'm sorry, Cal. I'm sorry you're in this position. But I thought you deserved to know what you're up against. After she left, Cal sat with the folder, reading through the cases. In each one, individual landowners had fought CPG's eminent domain proceedings. In each one, they'd lost. The property had been seized, compensation paid at assessed value, usually far less than market rate, and the developments had proceeded. His phone rang. Roy Pritchard. Cal, I wanted to give you a heads up. Mayor Kowalski's office contacted me today, asking about the complaints you've filed, the break-in, the threatening note and call. He seemed very interested in whether we'd made any progress, whether we had evidence connecting anyone to the incidents. What did you tell him? The truth that we're investigating, but have no solid leads. But Cal, the mayor asking about an ongoing investigation is unusual. He's not supposed to have access to that information. It makes me wonder who he's reporting to. CPG. Probably. Just be aware the political situation is getting complicated. You're not just fighting a corporation. You're fighting people with connections, with influence, with resources you don't have. I know. Do you? Because I'm worried about you. This isn't just about property anymore. This is about power. And when powerful people don't get what they want, they stop playing nice. That night, Cal couldn't sleep. He lay in bed thinking about his grandfather, wondering if Harold had ever imagined it would come to this, his carefully preserved land becoming the center of a battle between preservation and profit, between individual rights and economic development. At 3 in the morning, Cal got up and drove back out to the land. He parked and walked into the darkness, using his flashlight to navigate the trail. He reached the clearing where he'd met Chloe and Zeke, turned off the light, and stood in the darkness listening. The night sounds of the forest surrounded him, wind in the trees, the creek in the distance, small animals moving through the underbrush. Somewhere, an owl called. The land was alive, indifferent to human conflicts, existing in its own ancient rhythm. Cal thought about everything. He stood to lose his safety, possibly his life if someone desperate enough came after him. He thought about his children, divided and angry. He thought about his financial struggles, about to get worse. And then he thought about those small, bright birds, nesting in the trees, raising their young, unaware they'd become part of a larger fight. They deserved this place. They'd found sanctuary here, just as Harold had intended. Cal made his decision standing there in the dark, surrounded by the land his grandfather had protected for 75 years. He would file the quiet title action. He would fight CPG, fight eminent domain if it came to that, fight until he had nothing left to fight with. Some things were worth fighting for, even when you knew you might lose. Cal was sitting at Pete Gannon's kitchen table 3 days later, reviewing survey maps one more time before Lloyd filed the quiet title action, when he noticed something odd about Harold's journal. The leather binding seemed thicker than it should be, given the number of pages inside. He ran his finger along the inside, back cover, and felt a ridge, something hidden beneath the lining. Using Pete's pocket knife, Cal carefully worked the aged glue loose until the leather separated from the backing board. Behind it, folded into a small square, was another letter. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The paper was newer than the journal entries, the ink less faded. The date at the top read the 3rd of July, 1983. Pete leaned over his shoulder as Cal began to read aloud. Asterisk. To whoever finds this, probably Cal, if things work out as I hope, asterisk. Asterisk. I've carried a burden for 37 years, and it's time I admitted the truth, even if I'm too much of a coward to do it while I'm alive. Asterisk. Asterisk. The land I bought wasn't just any land. In 1946, when J.K. Sutton offered to sell me those parcels, he was drunk and talkative. He told me the land had been owned by a Lenape family, the Whitehorses, until 1923. That year, during one of the many legal land seizures that happened across Pennsylvania, the family was forced to sell. They received $50 for 127 acres. $50. The sale document showed X marks where the family members signed because they couldn't write English. They were cheated. Plain and simple. Asterisk. Asterisk. Sutton bought the land from the county in 1925 for back taxes the Whitehorses couldn't pay after losing everything. He'd been holding it for 20 years when he sold it to me. I asked him what happened to the Whitehorse family. He said they disappeared, probably moved west like most of the remaining Lenape did. He didn't know and didn't care. Asterisk. Asterisk. But I cared. I went to Europe and saw what happens when people lose their land, their history, their proof of existence. I came home and found out my own country had done the same thing to the people who were here first, and I'd bought stolen land. I was part of that theft. Asterisk. Asterisk. I tried to find the Whitehorses in the late 40s and through the 50s. I searched records, contacted Indian agencies, wrote letters to Oklahoma, where many Lenape had been forced to relocate. I never found anyone. The trail was cold, erased by time and bureaucracy and deliberate forgetting. Asterisk. Asterisk. So I made a decision. I would keep the land safe until I could find the rightful owners or their descendants. I would protect it from development, from taxes, from anyone who might exploit it. I kept it secret because I knew if people found out I owned it, there would be pressure to use it, sell it, profit from it. And I couldn't do that with land that wasn't really mine to sell. Asterisk. Asterisk. This is my confession and my instruction. Find them. Find the White Horse descendants. Give the land back. This was never ours to keep. I bought stolen property, and I've spent my life trying to make that right by preserving it. But preservation isn't restitution. Only returning it can do that. Asterisk. Asterisk. I'm sorry I don't have the courage to do this myself while I'm alive. I'm sorry for the burden I'm placing on you, but I believe you'll do what's right, even when it's hard. That's why I chose you to find this. Asterisk. Asterisk. The land belongs to the White Horses. Help them reclaim it. Asterisk. Asterisk. Your grandfather. Asterisk. Asterisk. Harold. Asterisk. The Newsing 5/1/2000. Asterisk. Cal finished reading and set the letter down carefully. The room was silent except for the ticking of Pete's wall clock. He read the letter again, slower this time, making sure he hadn't misunderstood. Jesus, Pete said quietly, he's asking you to give away millions of dollars to people you've never met. He's asking me to return what was stolen 75 years ago by people who are all dead now. Pete sat down across from Cal. I'm not saying Harold was wrong to feel guilty, but legally, morally, Cal, you own this land. You didn't steal it. Your grandfather bought it in good faith. Did he? Knowing something was taken and being responsible for taking it are different things. The crime, if you want to call it that, happened in 1923. Nobody involved in that is alive to answer for it. Cal stared at the letter, his mind reeling. Everything had just changed. The land wasn't a gift from his grandfather, it was a task, a responsibility, possibly a penance Harold couldn't complete himself. And if Cal followed through, he'd be giving up the only asset he had. I need to tell Lloyd about this, Cal said. Lloyd Hutchins read the letter twice, then removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. They were in his office, surrounded by law books and the musty smell of old documents. This complicates everything, Lloyd said. If you're claiming the land through Harold's purchase, but Harold's purchase was of land fraudulently taken from indigenous owners, there's a legitimate question about the validity of the entire chain of title. Can the White Horses, if I find them, can they claim the land? Legally? It's complicated. Most indigenous land claims have statute of limitations issues. The seizure happened 100 years ago. Courts generally don't recognize claims that old unless there's a clear violation of treaty rights. Lloyd paused. But morally? Ethically? That's a different question entirely. Harold wanted me to find them and return the land. I understand that. But Cal, you need to think carefully about what you're considering. If you establish ownership through the quiet title action and then voluntarily transfer the land to White Horse descendants, you're giving up the only valuable asset you have. You'll have nothing. And your children, they have a potential claim to this inheritance too. Graham, especially, would likely challenge any decision to give the land away. Cal thought about Graham's face during their last meeting, the anger and accusations. Graham doesn't get a vote. The land isn't his. Not legally, not yet, but if you die before resolving this, it would pass to your children. They'd have to deal with Harold's request. Or ignore it. That's why I need to do this now, while I can. Lloyd leaned back in his chair. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment. Harold felt guilty, and guilt is a powerful emotion. But what if he was wrong to feel that way? What if the 1923 sale, however unjust by modern standards, was legal at the time? What if the White Horse family has moved on, built new lives, and doesn't want or need land in Pennsylvania? What if you're about to disrupt their lives with a complicated gift they never asked for? Then I'll know I tried to do the right thing. The right thing according to whom? Harold's guilt? Your sense of justice? What about your own survival, your own family's needs? Cal had no answer that didn't sound naive or self-righteous. Lloyd was right. He was potentially throwing away his future based on a dead man's guilt and his own vague sense of moral obligation. But sitting in that office, holding Harold's confession, Cal couldn't imagine any other course of action. His grandfather had spent 3/4 of a century carrying this burden. The least Cal could do was try to finish what Harold had started. "Help me find them," Cal said. "The Whitehorse family. If they exist, if there are descendants, help me find them." Lloyd was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know someone who might be able to help, Dr. Anita Proudfoot at the Pennsylvania Historical Society. She specializes in Lenape history and genealogy. If anyone can trace the Whitehorse family, it's her." 2 days later, Cal sat in Dr. Proudfoot's cluttered office in Harrisburg. She was 59, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that missed nothing. Her walls were covered with maps, photographs, and documents related to Pennsylvania's indigenous history. Cal explained everything: the deeds, Harold's confession, the 1,923 forced sale. Anita listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When he finished, she sat back in her chair. "The Whitehorse story isn't unique," she said. "Thousands of Lenape families were displaced, dispossessed, erased from official records. Many were forced to Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma. Others, scattered, changed their names, tried to disappear into white society to protect their children. The cultural erasure was systematic and deliberate. Can you find them? I can try." "The name Whitehorse is good, it's distinctive. If they were forced off land in 1923, there should be records, possibly in county archives or Indian agency documents. Let me start searching. It might take weeks, maybe months, but if descendants exist, I'll find them." Cal left her office with a fragile sense of hope and a growing dread about what would happen when word of this spread. Graham would be furious. CPG would intensify pressure. The community would take sides. He called Penny that evening, explained what he'd found in Harold's journal. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. "You're really going to do this?" she said finally. "Give away the land?" "If I find the rightful owners, yes." "Dad, I admire the principle, I really do, but you're going to end up with nothing. Worse than nothing, you'll have legal fees, survey costs, all the money you've already spent, and no land to show for it." "I know, and you're okay with that?" Cal thought about his grandfather, carrying guilt for decades, unable to make it right. He thought about the Whitehorse family, their descendants scattered and displaced, never knowing someone had tried to preserve what was taken from them. "I have to be," he said. After hanging up, Cal sat in his trailer and waited for the anger, the regret, the second-guessing to arrive. But what he felt instead was a strange sense of peace. For the first time since finding the deeds, he knew exactly what he was supposed to do. The next morning, Cal received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a woman's voice said, "Mr. Remer, my name is June Crowfeather. Dr. Proudfoot contacted me. She said, you have information about my family's land." Cal's heart hammered. "You're a Whitehorse descendant?" "My grandmother was Mary Whitehorse. She married and became Mary Crowfeather. She died 5 years ago at 94. Until the day she died, she talked about the land that was stolen from her family. She never saw it, but her parents told her stories. She always said the land remembered them, even if people forgot." "Would you be willing to meet?" Cal asked. "I have a lot to explain. I'll drive up this weekend," June said. "Mr. Remer, I don't know what you have or why you're reaching out, but my grandmother spent her whole life carrying the story of that stolen land. If there's any truth to what Dr. Proudfoot suggested, if there's any justice possible after all these years," her voice caught. Thank you for trying." After the call, Cal sat with his head in his hands, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd set in motion. He'd found them. The descendants existed, and in 3 days he'd meet them and begin the process of giving away everything he'd discovered. Graham would never forgive him. CPG would probably escalate their threats. The community would be divided. But somewhere, Harold's ghost might finally find rest. And maybe, just maybe, a century-old wrong could begin to be righted. Dr. Proudfoot called Cal 2 days before June Crowfeather was scheduled to arrive. Her voice carried the excitement of a researcher who'd struck gold in dusty archives. "I found the original 1923 document," she said. "Millerton County Courthouse, basement storage. It's labeled as a voluntary sale, but the details tell a different story." She emailed him a scan. Cal opened it on his laptop, his stomach tightening as he read. The document showed the Whitehorse family, Joseph, age 47, his wife Martha, age 43, and their 3 children selling 127 acres for $50 total. Next to each name was an X mark, with his mark, or her mark, written beside it by the county clerk. At the bottom, a notation: "Sale conducted under authority of Indian Affairs Regulations. Property to be liquidated for unpaid taxes. $50 for land their family had lived on for generations, taxes they couldn't pay because they'd been systematically excluded from economic opportunities. A signature they couldn't make because they'd been denied education." The injustice was documented in careful bureaucratic handwriting, legal and devastating. The children, Anita continued, were Joseph Jr., age 16, Mary, age 14, and Ruth, age 11. Joseph Jr. died in 1928 Spanish flu. Ruth died in 1935, complications from childbirth. Mary survived. She was sent to the Carlisle Indian School, then later to a boarding school in Oklahoma. That's where the trail picks up again. You said she became Mary Crowfeather. She married Walter Crowfeather in 1934. They had 4 children. 2 died young, common in that era, especially in Indian communities with limited health care. The surviving children were Walter Jr., born 1936, and Grace, born 1938. Grace is June's mother. She's still alive, Cal. She's 86 and lives in Pittsburgh with June. Cal felt the weight of those names, those lives, the thread of survival stretching from 1923 to now. June's grandmother Mary had been 14 years old when her family was forced off their land. She'd lived 70 more years carrying that story, never seeing the place again, never knowing someone was trying to protect it. "When can I use this information?" Cal asked. "It's public record. Use it however you need to." "But Cal," Anita paused, "be prepared for resistance. Some people won't understand why you're doing this. Others will actively oppose it. Land return is controversial even when the moral case is clear." That afternoon, Lloyd called with less encouraging news. "Word is spreading about your intentions. I don't know how. Maybe someone at the Historical Society, maybe your conversation with June Crowfeather. But Carlton Voss called my office this morning. He knows you're planning to transfer the land to indigenous descendants." "What did he say?" "He threatened to contest the quiet title action, claims there are competing interests that haven't been properly investigated. He's also suggesting that if you're admitting the land was stolen from the Whitehorses, then your own claim through Harold's purchase is invalid. It's illegal. Catch-2. 2. Either the land is yours to claim and you're denying historical injustice, or you acknowledge the injustice and undermine your own legal standing." Can he actually block this? He can make it expensive and time-consuming. And Cal, there's something else. The mayor has scheduled a town hall meeting for next week, ostensibly about economic development, but really about your land. CPG is presenting their Millerton Meadows proposal publicly. They're going to paint you as an obstacle to the town's prosperity. Should I attend? You should. And you should bring June Crowfeather if she's willing. Let people hear the full story, not just CPG's version. That evening, Graham showed up at Cal's trailer unannounced. He looked tired and angry, his expensive jacket wrinkled like he'd slept in it. "Is it true?" he demanded without preamble. "Are you really planning to give the land to some Indians you've never met?" Cal bristled at the term, but kept his voice level. "I'm planning to return stolen property to its rightful owner's descendants. Yes, I'm planning. They have villians. I'm planning. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds? Grandpa bought that land legally 75 years ago. Whatever happened before that isn't your responsibility." Harold thought it was his responsibility. He spent his whole life trying to make it right. Harold was guilty over things that weren't his fault. "That's not wisdom, Dad, that's trauma." Graham paced the small living room. "I've got creditors calling me every day. I'm going to lose my apartment. My startup is failing. And you have the ability to help me to help yourself, but instead you're giving millions of dollars to strangers because of some misguided sense of historical justice. The land isn't worth millions anymore. There's a restrictive covenant. I know about the covenant. I talked to a lawyer. It can be challenged, broken. We could fight it in court, but you'd rather just hand everything over to people who have no legal claim whatsoever. They have a moral claim. Moral claims don't pay rent." Graham's voice rose. "Moral claims don't feed your grandkids. Moral claims don't fix your truck or keep you from getting evicted. Wake up, Dad. The world doesn't reward people for doing the right thing. It rewards people who look out for themselves." "Is that what I taught you?" Graham laughed bitterly. "You didn't teach me anything, except how to be broke and noble. And I don't want to be either. Then maybe you should leave." They stared at each other across the small room, years of distance and disappointment hanging between them. Finally, Graham shook his head. "When you're homeless and broke, and those crow feathers have moved on with your land, don't call me. I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore." He walked to the door, then turned back. "And for the record, Penny agrees with me. She's just too polite to say it to your face." After Graham left, Cal called Penny. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Graham was here," Cal said. "I know. He called me before he drove up. He said you agree with him." Penny sighed. "I agree that you're taking a huge risk. I agree that you're choosing principle over survival. But, Dad, I also know that if you gave the land to Graham or sold it to CPG or did anything except what you believe is right, it would eat you alive. You'd have money and hate yourself. So no, I don't fully agree with Graham. I understand why you're doing this, even if I think it's going to hurt you. That's more than I hoped for. Just promise me you'll be careful. That town hall meeting, it's going to get ugly. CPG has been campaigning hard, talking about jobs and prosperity. People are desperate for good news. When you stand up and tell them the land is going to someone else, they're not going to be sympathetic." Cal promised to be careful, though he wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Saturday afternoon, June Crowfeather arrived with her brother Frank. June was 57, with long, grey-streaked hair and her grandmother's dark eyes. Frank was 53. Quieter, more reserved. They met Cal at the Millerton Diner, sitting in a booth by the window, while early winter rain streaked the glass. Cal laid out everything, the deeds, Harold's letters, the 1,923 forced sale document, Pete's survey results. June read through the papers slowly, her hands trembling. When she reached the forced sale document with her great-grandparents' X marks, tears spilled down her cheeks. "My grandmother told me," June said quietly. She described the house where she was born, the creek where she played, the trees her father climbed as a boy. She died, never seeing it again. She used to say, "The land remembered, even if the people forgot." Frank was more skeptical. "Why would you give this to us? You don't know us. You could sell this land, make a fortune." "Because it isn't mine to sell. My grandfather knew that. He tried to find you for years. I'm just finishing what he started." "But what's your angle?" Frank pressed. Nobody does this without wanting something. Cal understood the suspicion Frank's people had been lied to, cheated, betrayed too many times to accept generosity at face value. I don't have an angle. I have a responsibility. The land was stolen from your family. Returning it is the only thing that makes sense. They talked for 2 hours. June shared stories her grandmother had told, the specific bend in the creek where the water was coldest, the oak tree split by lightning, the place where Joseph Whitehorse had proposed to Martha. She'd never seen these places, but the descriptions had been passed down like sacred texts. "Would you like to see it?" Cal asked. "The actual land?" June's eyes widened. "We can do that. It's technically in legal limbo, but I don't think anyone will stop us." They drove out to Kettle Creek in Cal's truck, June and Frank silent as they approached. When Cal parked and led them into the trees, following the trail to the creek, June stopped suddenly and put her hand over her mouth. "This is it," she whispered. "The oak tree, look. It's still split, and the creek bend, exactly like Grandma described." She walked to the water's edge and knelt, placing her palm on the ground. Frank stood beside her, his earlier skepticism replaced by something like reverence. Cal stayed back, giving them space. June reached into her pocket and pulled out a small beaded pouch, worn leather decorated with intricate patterns. "This was my grandmother's medicine bag. She made it when she was young, before they were forced to leave. The beads came from this land. She collected them from plants and stones here. She carried this bag for 80 years, and when she died, she gave it to me. She said, if I ever found my way back to the land, I should leave something there, so the land would know we remembered too." She opened the pouch and scattered something Cal couldn't quite see, seeds, maybe, or herbs onto the ground near the creek. Then she sat back, weeping quietly, while Frank put his arm around her shoulders. After several minutes, June stood and turned to Cal. "How do we do this? How do we make it legal? First, I establish ownership through a quiet title action. Then, once the court confirms the land is mine, I transfer the deed to you and Frank. Lloyd, my attorney, says it'll take months, maybe longer. There will be opposition from the development company and possibly from the town. There's a meeting Tuesday night. CPG is presenting their development proposal. They're going to argue that Millerton needs economic growth more than historical justice. People are desperate, jobs are scarce. They might not care about what happened 100 years ago." Frank's jaw tightened. "They never do." "Will you come to the meeting?" Cal asked. "Will you tell your family's story? People need to hear it from you, not from me." June and Frank exchanged glances. Finally, June nodded. "We'll be there. If my grandmother spent 80 years carrying this story, the least I can do is tell it to a room full of strangers." They spent another hour on the land before darkness fell. As they walked back to the truck, June said, "No matter what happens, even if we can't legally reclaim this land, thank you. Thank you for caring, for trying, for not just taking what you could have taken. My grandmother would have loved you." Driving home alone after dropping them at their hotel, Cal felt the weight of what was coming. Tuesday's town hall meeting would be a battle. CPG's money and influence versus one old man's attempt to right a historical wrong. He was outnumbered, outspent, and probably outmaneuvered. But he had the truth. And he had the crow feathers, carrying their grandmother's stories and her medicine bag. It would have to be enough. The Millerton Community Center was packed by 6:30, half an hour before the town hall meeting was scheduled to start. Cal arrived early with Lloyd, securing seats in the third row. June and Frank came in shortly after, both dressed simply but with quiet dignity. Cal introduced them to Lloyd, and they sat together, June clutching a folder of documents to her chest. At 7 o'clock, Mayor Gene Kowalski called the meeting to order. He opened with prepared remarks about Millerton's challenges, declining population, shrinking tax base, young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere. "But tonight," he said with rehearsed optimism, we have a chance to hear about something that could change our town's trajectory. I'd like to invite Carlton Voss from Consolidated Properties Group to present their vision for Millerton Meadows. Voss stood and moved to the front with practiced ease. Behind him, assistants set up a projection screen. Within seconds, glossy renderings of the proposed development filled the screen. Neat rows of houses, landscaped streets, a community centre with a pool, retail spaces with cheerful storefronts. Thank you, Mayor Kowalski, council members, neighbours. Voss's voice was warm, inclusive. Millerton Meadows isn't just a housing development, it's a comprehensive revitalisation project. 600 residential units, creating homes for families who want small-town values with modern amenities. And most importantly, jobs. He clicked through slides showing economic projections. 300 construction jobs during building, 50 permanent retail positions, increased property values, a projected $10 million in new tax revenue over 5 years. This isn't just about CPG's profit, Voss continued. This is about saving Millerton. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Cal watched faces around the room. People were leaning forward, interested, hopeful. Then Voss's tone shifted. Of course, every project faces obstacles. In this case, there's one parcel of land, approximately 127 acres, that we haven't been able to acquire. Without it, the project's viability is significantly reduced. We've made generous offers to the property claimant. Unfortunately, those offers have been refused. Several heads turned toward Cal. Private property rights are important, Voss said, but so is the public good. The question we face tonight is whether one person's preference should stand in the way of progress that could help hundreds of families. A woman stood up. Are you talking about eminent domain? That's one option the town council could consider, Voss said carefully. If negotiation isn't possible, and if the council determines that this project serves the public interest, then yes, eminent domain could be appropriate. For 20 minutes, people asked questions. Voss answered smoothly, always emphasizing jobs and revitalization. Finally, Irene Kowalski stood. Mr. Voss, you've done projects like this in other Pennsylvania towns, correct? We have. Very successfully. Can you tell us about Westfield? She held up a folder. There were complaints about shoddy construction, promised amenities that never materialized. And in Bradford County, your projections never mentioned the tax burden on existing residents. She paused. And in both cases, you used eminent domain to acquire holdout properties. Families who'd owned land for generations were forced to sell at below-market rates. Voss's professional demeanor cracked. Those were legal proceedings, properly executed. Legal doesn't mean right, Irene said. Cal stood. I'd like to address the room. The mayor hesitated, then nodded. Cal moved to the front, his heart hammering. Most of you know me. I've lived in Millerton my whole life. I'm not eloquent like Mr. Voss. I'm just a guy trying to do what's right. He explained about Harold's letters, about the 1,923 forced sale, about the Whitehorse family. As he spoke, faces changed, some sympathetic, some skeptical. When he mentioned the $50 sale price and the X marks, several people shifted uncomfortably. My grandfather spent 75 years protecting that land because he knew it was stolen. He tried to find the family it was taken from. He couldn't, but I did. Cal gestured to June and Frank. These are June and Frank Crowfeather. Their grandmother was Mary Whitehorse. She was 14 years old when her family was forced off their land. June stood, her voice steady despite her nervousness. My grandmother told me about the land. She described it in detail, the creek, the trees. She never saw it again after 1923, but she never forgot. She held up the 1,923 forced sale document. This is how Pennsylvania treated my family. $50 for 127 acres. X marks because they couldn't write in English. Not because they weren't smart, but because they were deliberately denied education. She pulled out the beaded medicine bag. My grandmother made this when she was a girl, from materials she gathered on that land. She carried it for 80 years. When she died, she gave it to me and said if I ever found the land again, I should tell it we remembered. The room was silent. June's emotion was raw, impossible to dismiss. Frank stood next, his voice harder. I'm skeptical of white guilt. Too often, people apologize for injustice but don't actually do anything about it. Cal Remer is different. He's trying to make it right, even though it costs him everything. He looked around the room. You can take that land again. You probably will. Money and power usually win. But you'll know what you're doing. You can't claim ignorance this time. The room erupted in competing conversations. Mayor Kowalski struggled to regain control, finally banging his gavel repeatedly. When the room quieted, Voss stood again, his friendliness replaced by cold professionalism. This is a very emotional story. But let's be practical. The Crowfeathers don't have legal ownership, and even if they establish ownership, the restrictive covenant prevents development. So Mr. Remer is offering land they can't use for anything except symbolic justice. He turned to face the crowd. Meanwhile, real families in Millerton need real opportunities. We're offering jobs, housing, economic growth, not symbolic gestures. Real, tangible improvement. Mayor Kowalski stood. The town council will be voting in 2 weeks on whether to support CPG's petition for eminent domain proceedings. The meeting didn't end cleanly. As people filed toward the exits, groups formed, some around Voss, others around the Crowfeathers, a few around Cal. The conversations were heated, opinions divided. Pete Gannon pulled Cal aside. That took guts. But you know the council's going to vote for eminent domain. Jean's been in CPG's pocket for months. I know, but we keep fighting. Penny appeared through the crowd, her face conflicted. She hugged Cal briefly. You did good, Dad. You told the truth. That counts for something. June and Frank approached, both looking drained. Thank you for letting us speak, June said. At least they heard us. That's more than my grandmother ever got. Outside, Chuck Bellamy intercepted Cal in the parking lot. You're making a mistake. These people will vote for eminent domain because they need what CPG is offering. And when they take your land, you'll get a fraction of what you could have had. Then I'll get a fraction. You think if the Crowfeathers get the land, they'll keep it? They can't afford the property taxes. You're setting them up for another loss. The words stung because there was truth in them. But Cal pushed the doubt away. That's their decision to make. The black SUV was parked at the far end of the lot, engine running. Cal walked directly toward it. As he approached, the passenger window rolled down. A man in his 40s, wearing sunglasses, despite the darkness. We can make this go away, the man said. All of it. CPG will drop everything if you just walk away from the land, abandon your claim. And if I don't, then things get harder. For you, for the Crowfeathers, for everyone. Why put yourself through that? Who are you? The man smiled without warmth. Someone who solves problems, and right now, you're a problem. The window rolled up. The SUV pulled away. Cal called Roy Pritchard, reported the interaction. Roy promised increased patrols, but they both knew it wouldn't make much difference. The next morning, Penny called with devastating news. Graham went to Lloyd's office. He's threatening to file a legal challenge to your claim. He says, as a direct descendant of Harold, he has an equal right to the inheritance. He's claiming you're not mentally competent. Cal sat down heavily. His own son was trying to have him declared incompetent. Lloyd thinks it's a bluff, Penny continued. Graham doesn't have money for a sustained legal fight, but CPG might fund him just to create chaos. Would you testify against me? Dad, no. Never. You're the most clear-headed you've been in years. Lloyd called an hour later with better news. I connected with a professor at Penn State who's an expert on the Endangered Species Act. He's willing to survey your grandfather's land, document the bird species. If he confirms endangered species are nesting there, We can file for federal protection. That would trump local economic development claims. How long will the survey take? A week, maybe 2. He's coming this weekend. That weekend, Cal met Dr. Philip Kowalski on the land. They spent 2 days walking the property, the professor documenting everything: bird calls, nesting sites, species diversity. On the second evening, sitting by the creek as light faded, Dr. Kowalski showed Cal his findings. You've got cerulean warblers, golden-winged warblers, wood thrush, all species of concern. This land is ecologically significant. It's a refuge in an increasingly developed landscape. Can you stop the development? I can provide documentation that makes stopping it legally defensible. Whether that's enough depends on judges, politics, money. But scientifically, this land should be protected. The town council vote was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Cal, June, Frank, Lloyd, and Pete gathered at Lloyd's office the night before to prepare. They had Dr. Kowalski's report, documentation of the historical injustice, legal arguments against eminent domain. Whatever happens tomorrow, Lloyd said, you've done something remarkable. You've told a truth that needed telling. That matters, regardless of the legal outcome. June reached across the table and took Cal's hand. My grandmother would have loved you. Win or lose, you've already honored her memory. That night, Cal couldn't sleep. He thought about Harold, about the Whitehorse family, about his own children divided by this land. He thought about all the ways this could still go wrong. But mostly, he thought about doing the right thing, even when it cost everything. That had to mean something. The next morning dawned cold and grey. Cal, dressed carefully in his best shirt, 15 years old but clean and pressed. He met the others at the courthouse steps. June looked terrified. Frank was stoic as always. Lloyd carried 2 briefcases full of documents. Ready? Lloyd asked. Cal nodded, though he wasn't sure ready was the right word. Resigned, maybe. Determined. They walked into the building together, knowing that in a few hours everything would be decided. The council chambers were smaller than the community centre, seating maybe 50 people. By the time the meeting started, every seat was full, and people lined the walls. Cal sat in the front row with Lloyd, June, and Frank. His hands were steady, though his heart wasn't. Mayor Kowalski called the meeting to order and outlined the vote. Whether to support Consolidated Properties Group's petition for eminent domain proceedings on the parcel commonly known as the Remer Whitehorse property. Voss spoke first, his presentation brief and pointed. Jobs, tax revenue, community benefit. He'd learned from the town hall less emotion this time, just numbers and projections. Lloyd stood next. He presented Dr. Kowalski's environmental report, the documentation of endangered species, the federal protections that would apply. He explained the restrictive covenant, the legal complexities, the precedents against eminent domain when federal environmental law was implicated. This isn't just about property rights or historical justice, Lloyd concluded. This is about whether we value short-term economic promises over long-term environmental stewardship and moral integrity. The council members asked questions, some genuine, some designed to support predetermined positions. Finally, the mayor called for public comment. June stood first. She didn't repeat her story. Instead, she simply said, "My grandmother carried the memory of this land for 80 years. She never asked for revenge or compensation. She just wanted acknowledgement that what happened to her family was wrong. Mr. Remer has given us that. Whatever you decide tonight, that acknowledgement can't be taken away." Pete Gannon stood next. "I knew Harold Remer for 40 years. He was a good man. He protected that land for a reason. Maybe we should trust his judgment over a corporation none of us knew existed 6 months ago." Others spoke, the division in the room clear and painful. When no one else stood, Mayor Kowalski called for the vote. 4 council members voted in order of seniority. The first vote, in favor of supporting eminent domain. The second, against. The third, In favor. Cal's chest tightened. 2-2. The final vote would decide everything. Dorothy Hughes, who'd taught at the elementary school for 30 years, sat forward. I've been thinking about what we're teaching our children, about what kind of community we want to be. If we take this land now, knowing its history, knowing it's wrong, what are we saying about our values? She paused. I vote against supporting eminent domain. Let the land stay protected. We'll find another way forward. The vote was defeated. 2 in favor, 3 against. Voss stood immediately, his expression hard. CPG has other options. We can still pursue eminent domain through state channels. This isn't over. Yes, it is, a voice said from the back. Everyone turned. A man in an expensive suit stepped forward. I'm Richard Sutherland, General Counsel for Consolidated Properties Group. Mr. Voss, you're terminated effective immediately. CPG is withdrawing all petitions related to this project. The room erupted. Voss turned on his own lawyer. You can't. The company's board reviewed the environmental report. The legal exposure from proceeding against federal protections is too high. Combined with the restrictive covenant and the publicity around the indigenous land claim, this project is no longer viable. We're cutting our losses. Sutherland handed papers to the mayor and left. Voss followed, his career in Millerton clearly over. Cal sat motionless, trying to process what had just happened. They'd won. 3 months later, on a cold March morning, Cal stood in the Millerton County Courthouse with June, Frank, Lloyd, and Pete. The quiet title action had been successful. The land was legally Cal's, and in 5 minutes it would be legally the Crowfeathers. The deed transfer was simple, administrative. A county clerk processed the paperwork, stamped the documents, filed them officially. June and Frank Crowfeather were now the recorded owners of 127 acres along Kettle Creek. June cried. Frank's eyes got wet too when the clerk handed him the deed. What will you do with it? Cal asked afterward, standing outside the courthouse. Protect it, June said. We're working with a land trust to establish a conservation easement. The land will be preserved as natural habitat. We're also creating a small cultural center, just a place where our people can gather, where we can teach our history. And we're going to name it after your grandfather, Harold's Sanctuary. Cal's throat tightened. He'd like that. The Crowfeathers had insisted on helping Cal financially. They'd pooled family resources and paid off his trailer lot fees for a year. You gave us priceless land, Frank had said firmly. Let us give you shelter. Cal's work had picked up significantly after the council vote. People in town seemed to respect what he'd done. He had steady carpentry jobs now, enough to live on, even save a little. Penny called regularly, brought his granddaughter to visit. Their relationship had deepened, healed in ways Cal hadn't thought possible. Graham hadn't spoken to him since the council vote. Cal left messages occasionally, sent texts on birthdays. Maybe someday his son would understand. Maybe not. It hurt, but Cal had learned to live with that particular pain. That evening, Cal drove out to the land. He still thought of it as the land, even though it wasn't his anymore. June had given him a standing invitation to visit any time. He parked and walked to the creek, following the familiar trail. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. Birds called from the trees, some of them probably the endangered species Dr. Kowalski had documented. The water moved over stones with its ancient rhythm. Cal reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusted tractor key, the artifact that had started everything. He'd kept it all these months, a reminder of his grandfather's trust. Now, standing by the creek, he dug a small hole near the water's edge and buried the key there. It's done, Harold, he said quietly. The land is home. The white horses are home. You can rest now. He stood there as darkness gathered, feeling his grandfather's presence like a hand on his shoulder. Harold had carried guilt for 75 years, protecting land that wasn't his to keep, hoping someday to make things right. Cal had finished what his grandfather started. Walking back to his truck, Cal thought about inheritance, not just property or money, but responsibility, integrity, the courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything. That was what Harold had really left him. That was the gift. Cal drove home through the darkness to the small apartment he'd rented in town, modest but his own. Inside, he made coffee and sat at his kitchen table with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Sometimes what we inherit isn't meant to be kept. Sometimes we're just the ones trusted to give it back. And sometimes, in the giving, we find ourselves, the land remembered. And now, finally, so would everyone else.